So it's been a while that we have been here listening to these webinars on eHTA. So just to remind ourselves a little bit, as we discussed in the first webinar, getting to regulatory review is a long, costly journey, requires a lot of time conducting clinical, preclinical studies, clinical trials, and is quite costly. But unfortunately, that doesn't mark the end of the technology's life cycle. Receiving regulatory approval by the likes of the FDA in the United States, or EMA in Europe, or Health Canada here in Canada, marks only the beginning of the commercialization stage. And while researchers might be familiar with the first valley of death, which describes the difficulties of getting technologies to translate the in vitro data to humans, many are unfamiliar with the second valley of death, which refers to the gap between the translation and adoption of technologies to clinical practices. But hopefully that's not the case to all of you watching this webinar series, because you guys already know about the second valley of death. And again, why is it so hard to get technologies adopted into the healthcare system? As we discussed in the previous webinars, well, let's take a look at one of the examples that we discussed in the first webinar, which was the first inhaled insulin that hit the market and received regulatory approval because it showed that it was as effective as traditional insulin, but didn't meet market expectations. The technology was a bit bulky, as you can see in this figure, and it cost more than other alternatives on the market. For that particular case, patients thought the product was inconvenient, and interestingly enough, an eHTA study conducted by the core team here at UBC also showed that fewer adverse events and better blood glucose control were the main factors driving patients' decisions on insulin therapies. And mode of administration, or having an inhaled version, wasn't an important factor when they were making decisions about insulin therapies. And in the case of inhaled insulin as well, physicians didn't want to prescribe it because they didn't see any benefit apart from being a free needle option. And also, they didn't want to spend time learning and teaching patients on how to use it. And lastly, in case of the payers or insurance companies, they were unwilling to cover for this medication because they felt that it was too costly for the additional benefit it brought to the patients or the healthcare system. So, for example, in the UK, patients needed a physician to provide an assessment to prove that they had, in fact, needle phobia, and that they would require inhaled insulin and wouldn't be able to comply with the medication otherwise to get that drug covered by the government. And so this example and many others that we talked about, it just highlights that adoption of health technologies will depend on their value as compared to treatments already available in the market. And determining and demonstrating value of a technology is not easy. Why? Well, because value is in the eye of the beholder. Value depends on context, and stakeholders will value technologies differently. For example, the perceived benefit of a technology by a physician might not be the same for the patient or the payer because they use different criteria to make that assessment. And what makes the health technology ecosystem complex is that patients, for example, are the ones who are sick and will need treatment to improve their health, but they might not be aware of the costs of the medication because they're not the ones usually paying for that. On the other hand, payers, your insurance companies, for example, need to know the benefits of a treatment, but also take into account its costs, since they are paying for that. But they are also paying for other technologies for other patients. And unfortunately, they have to deal with the fact that their budget is limited. And that explains some of the reasons why countries use health technology assessments, or eHTAs, which uses evidence to determine the value of technologies for stakeholders and guide reimbursement decisions regarding those technologies. And eHTAs require a lot of work. As we saw in the previous webinar, there is a lot that goes into an eHTA. And so usually companies start working on the eHTA submission at the end of phase 2 or phase 3 trials. At this stage, the technology is already developed, with changes in the design of the technology itself unlikely to happen, because changing the technology at this point can cost millions of dollars, because then you have to rerun preclinical trials and clinical trials to get that data. And I guess to you watching this webinar, this may all sound interesting, but not applicable to your work, right? In fact, according to a poll that we did in the first webinar, most of you are in the discovery and preclinical stage. And while I hope by the end of this webinar, I can convince you otherwise, and also show you how you can take the same eHTA approach to inform early stages of the development. So the objective of this webinar is to describe the rationale for early health technology assessment and how it uses evidence to inform research and development activities. Specifically, this webinar will focus on what is early health technology assessment, its purpose, and how it can be used to inform questions, including which disease or indication to focus on, which product characteristics to optimize for, and what clinical data to collect. Then I'll just finish it off with some key takeaway messages, as well as some activities that the eHTA platform is working on. So what is early health technology assessment, or eHTA? Well, Zimmerman and colleagues define eHTA as all methods used to inform industry and other stakeholders about the potential value of new medical products in development, including methods to quantify and manage uncertainty. So, like eHTA, eHTA systematically assembles available evidence to identify the potential value of technologies. eHTA also consider the value for stakeholders within the healthcare technology ecosystem, like patients, payers, and physicians. What makes eHTA distinct from eHTA is that eHTA is not used to inform reimbursement process. Instead, eHTA is used to inform and help developers with their own decisions about their technology they are working on. So when conducting an eHTA, evidence on safety and efficacy on the technology itself is limited, but that doesn't mean that there isn't information in the area that could inform the development process. There are other factors that could help inform those decisions that have existing evidence, including available evidence of alternative interventions that are already on the market, the standard of care, and patients' preferences. So most of eHTA activities will happen at early stage of development. And here, even though the figure depicts eHTA and eHTA as two separate stages, I think it's better to think of them within a continuous spectrum where one doesn't end when the other starts. Both activities, though used for different purposes, can coexist And again, both use evidence to identify and determine value to inform decisions. And again, some information that you generate through an eHTA process can also be used to inform an eHTA. So that's not, so that's something that is important to know as well. And again, I cannot cover in just one webinar all methods in fine detail about the eHTA and how it can be used to inform development decisions. But I will hope that I can cover some aspects of eHTA that hopefully might be helpful to you and that you can start thinking about them when you go back to conducting your own research. So at the discovery and preclinical stages, as I remember most of you are, one of the questions that one may have is, well, which disease or indication to focus on? Or similarly, you may already have an indication in mind and ask yourself, well, should I focus on this particular indication? Or maybe, is this the right indication for me? Or do I have evidence to support this indication? And to answer those questions, some of you might be thinking, well, do I need to do an eHTA to answer that? Well, I could identify the indication or have evidence to support my indication by just maybe Googling or talking to a clinician expert in the area. And doing that, you will eventually find an indication or an answer to your question. And there is nothing wrong with that. But what eHTA brings to the table is a systematic approach to collect and analyze evidence in the best way to answer that particular question, while also minimizing any bias people may have that people working closely to this project may have about their technology. It's just trying to get an impartial information about that particular question that you may have regarding your technology. And going back to the question that we are trying to answer, so our team did a review on the published papers in the literature to find the answer for that question. And here is a list of the main papers that we found. Feel free to have a read on them. In particular, I would like to recommend the Got-It Target Assessment paper, in which a group of researchers and pharmaceutical industry folks got together to establish a targeted framework. So first of all, the key factors for a successful target indication will involve the understanding of your target, its role in the disease pathway, basic mechanisms of the molecule that will be the active ingredient of your final medical product. And it's important to understand those three components and their interactions among themselves. And you may not have all the answers about those three components until you conduct all clinical trials. But that doesn't mean you don't start thinking about them early on. And it's important to know about those factors to minimize science risks and improve your chances on getting through the first valley of death. And if you are from NMIN, you are lucky because you have PharmaCore and NanoCore, both facilities that can help you with studies to understand the pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, as well as ways to improve delivery of your molecule to its target and help you minimize science risks. And I think also that shows you that getting health technologies to move from the lab to the commercialization stage really requires a multidisciplinary approach, because every one of these core facilities, for example, will have different knowledges and will help you inform on how to develop your technology. And again, eHTA is only one component of this entire process. So again, going through the first value of death, as a reminder, is just one part of the story. As I said earlier, there is the second value of death that is related to adoption after regulatory approval. And to minimize adoption risks related to the second value of death, one is important that you consider the intellectual property and freedoms to operate in this area. And I will not go through that because I'm not an expert on that. And I'm sure that you will have those resources available at the universities or institutes that you're working on. And I would advise for you to check them out to know about IPs. But to also minimize adoption risks, and also that's where eHTA is involved, it's about understanding unmet need, competitive landscape, and commercial potential of your technology. So now I would like to spend the next couple of slides on unmet need. Why? Well, I would say that all papers that we looked at to develop our eHTA platform talked about the importance of identifying or knowing about the unmet need for a particular indication. And I would say it's a term very much used if you are from the regulatory agency, or even if you are working in reimbursement, everybody uses that term, unmet need, addressing unmet need. And I'm sure some, if not all of you, have heard about unmet need and have seen or even used that term when you're writing your grant or research proposal. So let's just have an exercise now and see if people are paying attention to this webinar. So I would encourage you, if you have heard about unmet need or even used that term in your grant, please type yes in the chat. Or maybe I'm mistaken and you have never heard about unmet need, so you can just type no. So just we have a sense on that. So just waiting for a couple of people to answer. Okay, so while we wait, so yeah, I see that a couple of people said yes. Maybe other people are shy. But okay, we have a couple more questions. But yeah, so unmet need is a term that we use around, and I'm also guilty of using that. But really, now I want you guys to start thinking about, well, but what is unmet need? And how do I demonstrate unmet need? And think about the works that you guys did. Well, how did you show that there was an unmet need in your research area? So unmet need is a term that is often used, but really there's no consensus on its definition. According to one study about the topic, the unmet need definition consists of 3 elements: alternative treatments, disease severity, and patient population. And I would like to spend the next slides just talking a little bit about this, because I think it's important for us to understand what is unmet need, so we are able to identify and see whether the technology that we are working on can help address that unmet need. So when it comes to alternative treatment, certainly if you have an indication where there is no alternative treatment available, there is a high indication of a high unmet need. But in many cases, you will have available options for a particular indication. And just counting the sheer number of treatments available might be misleading and inadequate when thinking about that unmet need. This stage is about understanding the current standard of care, assessing whether these available treatments are, again, available in the country that you are working on, accessible, and more importantly, measuring their benefits compared to all the other options. And just to remind that what is available, accessible, and is considered current standard of care will differ among countries. So knowing which market you'll be launching your product will dictate how you identify and address unmet need. So the second element important to consider is disease severity, which is tied to the burden to individual patients, And both alternative treatments and disease severity are key elements when you're considering an individual unmet need. Patient population is the third element of unmet need and is important when we look at societal unmet need. The societal unmet need is driven by epidemiological data, including incidence and prevalence. It could also include disease costs representing the economic burden of the indication. And though societal unmet need is an important aspect of unmet need, only considering patient population can be misleading. Many stakeholders making decisions on which technology to adopt will be more interested in the individual unmet need, as that it reflects more on what happens to patients. And really, if we think about it, if we only consider patient population as a measure of unmet need, then rare diseases, which by definition affects only a very small number of people, would not be in the conversation when we are talking about unmet need. And that's not the case. In many cases, rare diseases are very much in the conversation when we are talking about unmet need, because these patients usually don't have many treatment options available, and most rare diseases are life-threatening chronic conditions. So what eHTA does, again, is that eHTA collects evidence from the literature, including peer-reviewed studies, guidelines, and other eHTAs to identify the current standard of care. And in case of lack of information from the literature, eHTA, and depending also time, resources, eHTA will also conduct interviews or surveys with physicians, patients, and clinical experts to fill the gap in the literature. Specifically in the case of our eHTA platform, once standard of care is identified, we will use the same methodology to quantify unmet need by measuring the impact of available options in a particular indication. The eHTA platform will use outcome measures to determine the impact of standard of care, disease severity, so that we can determine the unmet need for that indication. And we can use outcome measures like mortality, symptoms, or QALYs. Our framework that we are working on can be adaptable to those different outcome measures so that it can be most suitable to capture the unmet needs in a particular indication. So I like to use QALYs, or quality adjusted life years, as an example of an outcome measure on how we can use that to identify and determine unmet need for a particular indication. So for those who might not remember QALYs. We discussed that in the second webinar, but QALYs is a measure that combines quality and quantity of life. It's often used in economic evaluations, and it has been adopted by countries like Canada, the UK, and the United States. So to identify and demonstrate unmet medical need, we would identify the QALY in the disease state and QALY without the disease to measure the medical need. And we would use data available from sources like existing eHTAs and guidelines to inform to calculate the QALYs for those two states. And then once we identify the current standard of care, we then can calculate the QALYs generated within the standard of care so that we can measure the unmet medical need. And again, eHTA uses existing information from eHTAs and guidelines. And here I just like to share some of the resources that we used. And if you guys are curious about it, you can also check it out. So the first one is the website by CADIT. So CADIT is the agency responsible for conducting eHTAs and informing reimbursement decisions for Canadian provinces. So they have the Gray Matters tool, which is a tool that lists multiple websites for different guidelines, health statistics, and eHTAs that you can use to get information on different standard of care or eHTAs, for example. Again, we also use existing eHTAs to uses that information to understand a little bit about unmet need for a particular indication. So I'd like to share some of the eHTAs databases that are out there. The first one is the database by eHTA that lists eHTAs that have been conducted across multiple organizations in different countries that you can have a look if you're interested in. Another useful resource is the ICER website that also have all the eHTAs conducted by that agency. So ICER, if you guys are not familiar with, we talked about it in the previous webinar. ICER is one of the agencies responsible for conducting eHTAs in the United States, and some private companies, private insurance companies there also use that information to inform their reimbursement processes. So, but at the early stage, it's not enough to know about the current standard of care, because while you are developing your product, well, the reality is that other companies might also be developing similar products that will compete with your product. And they might be far ahead in their development process. So it's important to identify the future standard of care and use that to calculate the future unmet needs, which then will inform how you can understand a little bit more the impact of your technology on that future unmet need. So, and the eHTA platform can help you with that. And one of the resources that we use, and I would like to share with you on how to see what is the competitive landscape for a particular indication, is the clinicaltrials.gov website. And I think some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with clinicaltrials.gov. If you're not, I would like to encourage you to have a look, So clinicaltrials.gov is a database on clinical trials that are being conducted in the US or really mainly across the globe. It's a database that is hosted by the US National Library of Medicine, and it has information on multiple clinical trials, their phases, and where they are in terms of recruitment or activities. And that is a simplified summary of how eHTA can help identify and demonstrate unmet needs. And our eHTA platform can also not only help you identify the unmet medical need, but also assess the competitive pipeline, patient population size and market size, potential cost offsets to help answer which disease or indication to focus on. And the role of eHTA, again, is to provide that information, but it's not to make the final decision. That will ultimately be up to whoever is developing the technology. That could be you or your supervisor or a company. And that's why I think I like to reiterate that we don't make that decision. And it's important that you be prepared, because there might be a case where the eHTA study will show that, well, for a particular indication that we are interested in, well, there is not a high unmet need, or maybe it's an indication where there are multiple competitors in the pipeline that are at the late stages of clinical trials, or maybe there's a small market size, and that information will be provided to you, and then it's up to you or whoever is developing that technology to make a decision whether to go ahead or go back and think about what to do with that technology. So once you've gone through this early stages and you have indication that you want to focus on, then you might be at a point in the development process when you start thinking, okay, now which product characteristics to optimize for? So you might have questions like, well, what should be my efficacy and safety target? Or if you're working with diagnostic tests, what should be my specificity and sensitivity target? Or maybe you will start thinking about it now, where do patients have preferences for mode of administration? And if you are at this stage and don't have a target in mind, I encourage you to start thinking about that, because that will be important and will help you guide your decisions moving forward, so that you are better prepared during the later stages of the clinical development. So for those questions, for example, the third one, do patients have preferences for mode of administration? One way that you could answer that is by using eHTA and conducting a discrete choice experiment. And that will be something like, so that kind of work is something that we conducted, for example, the core team conducted to answer about modes of preferences for the insulin therapy, which, as we discussed in the previous slides, that in fact, mode of administration for insulin therapy was not the main driver for making decisions about the insulin therapy. And again, eHTA uses evidence to inform the minimum performance benchmarks of a technology. So the way that eHTA does to help you answering these questions is that eHTA uses models to obtain the minimum performance of a new technology compared to standard of care within a given price. So let's just discuss one example so that I can show to you guys on how eHTA does, what eHTA does to answer this particular question. So this is one work that was conducted by CORE, by CORE on the diagnostic test for thyroid cancer. If you guys want to have a look, this is the paper, and you can have a read on that. But so thyroid nodules are lumps that form in your thyroid, which is an important gland located at the back of your neck. And most nodules are harmless, but some of them can be cancerous, and you will need to remove them surgically if they are malignant. And before conducting any surgery, a doctor will conduct a fine needle aspiration biopsy to evaluate if those nodules are malignant or not before undergoing any surgery. And the biopsy is the standard of care option, as it's cheap and easily available. But the biopsy results in many indeterminate cases that might go under surgery, even though they didn't have to. And what happened was that a new molecular diagnostic test could be used in adjunction with the biopsy to improve accuracy of the diagnosis for those indeterminate cases. So a simulation model was developed to estimate the clinical and economic outcomes of this new molecular test that was used in adjunction with the biopsy compared to standard of care for the diagnosis of thyroid nodules. So in that, economic model, 10,000 patients were simulated to undergo standard of care, and 10,000 patients were simulated to go the biopsy alongside with this new molecular test. And what the simulation showed us was that for the standard of care arm, around 4,400 patients underwent surgery when they didn't have to, and about 116 cases were missed. And thus, for the standard of care, the sensitivity and specificity were 97% and 30% respectively. And well, I guess for those who are unfamiliar with this term, sensitivity and specificity are important performance parameters for diagnostic tests. Sensitivity is the ability of a test to designate an individual with the disease as positive, and specificity is the ability of a test to designate an individual without the disease as negative. So with these models, we can estimate the outcomes and costs spent by varying sensitivity and specificity of a particular test. So for example, if we assume that this new test has both sensitivity and specificity set at 95%, then the number of unnecessary surgeries with this new test is 323. And in that case, 175 cases will be missed. That would lead to an incremental quality of 0.04 per patient, and the system would save about $1,080 per patient. So meaning, if you have that information, that if you can set up that test and a sensitivity and specificity of 95% for that test, then if this new test costs below $1,080 per patient, then you can show that this new strategy will be cost-saving and a good idea to get adopted by the healthcare system. Further, with these simulation models, We can also vary these important parameters or performance benchmarks. For example, here we can show to people that by varying sensitivity and specificity, that will help us determine the impact of those parameters on costs and health outcomes. So, for example, if specificity is fixed at 95%, we can see that, and if you can get the sensitivity anything below 87.5%, the incremental qualities will be negative, meaning you are generating less qualities with this new test and that people should stick with the standard of care. This figure also shows that sensitivity has a more important role in this, the results are more affected by sensitivity than specificity, and that sensitivity should be one to look out for when you are developing that diagnostic test. So that's just to show you how eHTA can help you inform the targets that you need to achieve when thinking about your technology. But let's say that you have done that already and you are at this stage of early clinical development where you're thinking about designing protocols for your clinical trials and you are not sure which clinical data to collect. You might have some ideas of clinical data that is important to get regulatory approval. But what I want to remind all of you is that data requirement for regulatory review and the reimbursement process are not the same. And eHTA can help you inform which outcomes might be important when considering the reimbursement process. So, for example, let's use inclisiran, the latest PCSK9 inhibitor on the market, as an example to show you the differences between data requirements for regulatory review and eHTA. So again, inclisiran is an siRNA therapy that acts by inhibiting PCSK9 to lower LDL levels or bad cholesterol levels in the blood, so to reduce the risks of cardiovascular events. So just to show you quickly, as you can see, for the decisions done by Health Canada or the regulatory review side, they mainly focus on the LDL levels as the outcome measure. On the other hand, for the reimbursement decisions, well, first they were interested in knowing whether they had any information about inclisiran as compared to other PCSK9 inhibitors that were available in Canada and ezetimibe. And again, they were looking at other outcomes, not only the bad LDL levels, but they were also interested in knowing whether the companies submitting inclisiran reimbursement decisions had data on stroke, myocardial infarction, resuscitated cardiac arrest outcomes or mortality, and QALYs, and they used that to make their decisions about that technology. And if you are interested in knowing about that and the differences between the regulatory review process and the eHTA and reimbursement process, you can check out the CARET website. They have a list of all the health technology assessments that they have conducted, and they have multiple documents on how their review process is done and how the recommendations are generated for a particular technology. So in conclusion, again, eHTA uses evidence synthesis and rigorous methods to inform developers about the potential value of their technology. eHTA identifies the drivers of adoption to help with go, no-go decisions, market strategies, and placement in the treatment pathway.
Fernanda, could you go back to your slide where you show what Health Canada does and what CADA does? And maybe perhaps just explain why do they look at different things, and if it's possible for one of the if Health Canada gives a positive review, is it possible for CADA to give a negative review, and why would that happen?
Yeah, so, well, fun fact, for this particular example, actually, CADA gave a negative review, actually. They recommended not to reimburse inclisiran, even though Health Canada approved that for market authorization. And the way I like to think about why they require different data is think about, well, they're making different decisions, right? So Health Canada is pretty much about knowing whether the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks. And so they will use their outcome data to inform that. On the other hand, CADA's looking for the implementation side and whether that particular technology will provide any benefit to the healthcare system. So while, for example, in this case, LDL levels might give you an indication of the risk of cardiovascular events, really is a surrogate outcomes. It doesn't really provide them with information. Well, will this actually translate to less hospitalizations, less cost to the healthcare system? And that's why they look at other outcomes like stroke, for example, so that they can know whether that new medication will have an impact on the costs or the resources available in the healthcare system.
Okay. So Nick, I'm going to call on you and ask you, you're the technical lead on the eHTA. What else do people need to know here that, which point would you emphasize, underline that Fernanda has raised in her presentation today in terms of what researchers should keep in mind in terms of considering which avenue to pursue in terms of various findings that they may have that might have clinical applications?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is, or I guess related things. One is that adoption risk is really important, not just because you might end up with that technology approved and it doesn't get adopted, which is not great for anyone, but because everyone else in the ecosystem is well aware of that possibility. And so understanding and having you might still decide to go with a specific indication because there's always trade-offs, but actually being able to go to investors and potential partners and having a sort of informed discussion about that shows you've actually thought through the pros and cons and the risks, the adoption risk, I think is really important to show, basically professionalism and the fact that you've thought that through. And I think one of the things that, I think it's really worth highlighting is that these resources, those existing health technology assessments for drugs or other therapies that are already in the same indication or space are extremely valuable resources. And they're all publicly available. You can go to CADIS or NICE's website or ICER's website and go read them. They're very long and technical sometimes, but they have like executive summaries, and just start getting a sense of what are the main things that what are the weaknesses in those assessments, and how can you maybe try to think about how you would avoid those if your technology got through.
That's great.
Okay, great, thanks. Really nice presentation, Fernanda. Thanks a lot for giving all the details. I guess my question is, in your presentation you talked about that it's good to know the regulatory requirements that might be needed for the product. So what do you suggest that be the starting point? Like, first of all, I guess we need to classify our product. So which resources do you think would be a good good starting point to figure where the product falls? Like, does it fall under medical devices, or does it fall under biologicals or therapeutics? So how do we go about that? I know that we can do it on FDA product classification, but if it's not really transparent from that, what other resources can we use to give us a better understanding of the product classification for our specific product?
Yeah, thanks, Nashmia. Great question. Well, first of all, I would say that especially if you're right now, I think a lot of you guys are working very specialized products, and sometimes they might fall under different categories depending on the regulatory agency that you are looking at. So I would assume that most of you are interested in launching a product in the FDA or in the United States first. So again, as you said, FDA is a great resource to look under which classification your product might fall in. They have some resources on how to understand a little bit more on that. I would say that if you're working on medical devices, that classification is a little bit trickier than if you're working on drugs, or for example, gene therapies. It's more straightforward. But under medical devices, they have a couple of definitions that can help you determine to identify under which category you are in. But I will start with the FDA. But if you have another country or jurisdiction that you're interested in, then I would advise you to check their regulatory agencies and their website to know a little bit more under which category or how they classified their health technology.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask a follow-up question?
If it's short, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It's just that, do you think that regulatory requirements differentiate if the active ingredient is same but the route of administration is changed?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Not sure if I understood.
For example, it's a gene therapy, but with a different route of administration, would the regulatory requirements be different? I'm sure they'll be different, but the classification of the product be different too?
Again, it's hard that I cannot give you a straight answer because I'm not sure what technology you're referring to, but usually gene therapies will fall under the same category. Now, some regulatory agencies will classify gene therapies as part of their, they will assess like any other drug or medical therapy, but other agencies, I believe EMA have a specific pathway for gene therapies or products in the similar vein, and then they will use different categories to assess that. So again, it depends on, again, which country we are talking about it.
Okay, thanks, Fernanda.